Hello everyone. Today I will tell a story about racism. A judge, because of his prejudice, made a wrong decision and received a really unexpected ending. This is a reminder that power comes with responsibility. And sometimes, only when losing everything, can people truly understand the value of justice. Judge Thomas Harding sat at his elevated desk scanning the room with a stern expression, his eyes cold and indifferent. He had seen hundreds of faces like the one before him, and they had all blurred into a sea of routine cases that he dealt with every day. It was easy to dismiss the people who stood in front of him when their stories were all so alike to him. All they were names and numbers. He barely bothered to memorize the details of their lives before handing down his verdict. His hands were already poised to deliver the same final words he had said countless times before, but today something felt different. It was hard to pinpoint, but there was a strange weight in the air. Jasmine Reed stood before him not as a defendant in the traditional sense, but as someone who carried an undeniable presence. It was subtle but palpable. She was composed, her posture straight and unhealing despite the uncertainty of the moment. There was an air of dignity in the way she held herself, as if she knew exactly who she was and where she stood in the world. Thomas didn't give it much thought as he prepared to issue his ruling on her case. Her violation was minor, a city ordinance. She had parked her car in the wrong place, but his irritation at the constant stream of trivial matters clouded his judgment. Before he even knew her name, he had already made his decision in his mind before she could even speak. The room felt stiflingly quiet for a moment as Jasmine was called to the stand, and she glanced briefly at the judge, her eyes cool yet unfazed by his gaze, her calm demeanor almost unnerving, as if she had dealt with far worse in her life than a small fine for a parking violation. Harding was already half tumming her out, his mind drifting to what he would have for lunch or how many more cases he had left for the day. He barely listened as she explained her case quietly. He dismissed her argument without much thought. Her words had no real weight in his mind. The facts were simple to him. The law was the law, and she was guilty by the book. In his eyes, she wasn't anything special, just another person who had made a mistake. He looked at the paper in front of him and scrawled out the fine amount before looking back up at her, his expression unchanged. He handed down his sentence, a half fine that would inconvenience her but not enough to cause any real trouble for someone like him, someone who lived in a world of structure and rules where everything could be solved by simply following the procedure. He watched her for a moment, waiting for some reaction, maybe anger or frustration, but Jasmine simply nodded once silently. She stood up and without a word walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking on the cold marble floor, and Judge Harding moved on to the next case, not realizing that this woman was far more than what he assumed her to be, and that this decision would change both of their lives forever. Jasmine Reed stepped out of the courtroom, her mind sharp but her face AASS of composure. She could feel the eyes of the clerks and security staff on her as she passed through the corridor, her heels clicking with a rhythmic echo that seemed to reverberate in the stillness of the courthouse. But she didn't flinch. She had grown used to being watched, the way people sized her up, the way their eyes lingered longer on her than on others. She was used to being underestimated, judged by the color of her skin or the way she dressed, but she was far from a stereotype. She had spent years carving out a place for herself in a system that wasn't built for her. She had worked harder than most to get where she was today, and no one was going to make her feel small, not even a judge like Thomas Harding. Jasmine wasn't just any woman. She wasn't a defendant who could be dismissed with a quick judgment or a fine. She was a director in a powerful department overseeing the entire city's judicial system. For years she had fought her way to the top, proving that she wasn't just a token figure in the office but a force to be reckoned with. Her work had influenced policies and shaped decisions that affected the lives of thousands. She worked tirelessly to ensure fairness and equity within a system that often turned a blind eye to the very people it was supposed to protect. Her department had the authority to review and evaluate the performance of judges and magistrates across the city, including the one who had just fined her. She had seen the reports on Thomas Harding before, though she had never met him in person. She had heard stories from her colleagues about his reputation as a non-nonsense judge with a tendency to be quick with his rulings and slow to consider the context of each case, and today she had experienced it firsthand. As Jasmine walked through the building, her mind didn't linger on the fine or the judgment passed by the judge. She had learned long ago to compartmentalize her emotions, especially when it came to the courtroom. She was used to being judged by people who didn't understand her. Her calm exterior had become a protective shield that kept her from the slings and arrows of biased decisions. She had faced them all her life, growing up in neighborhoods where people assumed she was destined for failure and rising through the ranks of a system that wasn't designed for her to succeed. But what had happened in that courtroom with Judge Harding wasn't just another case of racism or unconscious bias, it had been something different, something personal in the way he had looked at her without taking the time to even hear her side, something in the way he had dismissed her as another faceless defendant. It had ignited a spark within her, a sense of determination that she had learned to trust. Jasmine wasn't just going to let this go. She knew her role within the system. She had the power to challenge Harding's actions, but she also knew that this wasn't about retaliation. This was about something bigger. She had the ability to hold him accountable for his judgment, but also to help him grow as a judge and to help the entire judicial system evolve beyond its flaws and biases. She wasn't just going to be a passive observer in her own life. She had the strength and the position to make a real difference, and she would do so with grace but also with an unwavering resolve. As she entered her office, the weight of the day lifted from her shoulders just slightly. She placed her bag down and looked out the window toward the skyline of the city below. She had work to do, but there was a decision to be made, one that would change everything for both her and the judge, who had no idea who he had just wronged. A week had passed since that brief encounter in the courtroom, and Judge Harding was still uneasy. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, though he had no idea what. The case with Jasmine Reed had been so ordinary in his mind, just another fine, just another routine ruling in a long day, yet somehow her presence lingered with him like a quiet storm in the back of his mind. What he didn't know was that Jasmine had been quietly watching him from the other side of the courthouse, biding her time. She had a far more complex role in the judicial system than he could ever imagine. As the director overseeing the Judicial Review Board, Jasmine had been assigned to conduct evaluations of judges like him, ensuring that they upheld the highest standards of fairness and impartiality. This meant that Thomas Harding's rulings, including the fine he had handed down to her, were under her scrutiny. It wasn't long before Jasmine's opportunity to confront him arrived. A mandatory seminar on ethics and fairness in the judiciary was scheduled, and it was no coincidence that Judge Harding was on the list of attendees. The seminar was a chance for the department to assess judges not just through performance reviews but also through workshops designed to bring awareness to biases, systemic inequalities, and the ethical dilemmas that often cloud judicial judgment. Jasmine would be there, of course, as both a supervisor and a facilitator, but she would also be watching Harding closely. The day of the seminar, Harding walked into the conference room with his usual confidence, his expression set and professional. He didn't expect any surprises, only the usual training sessions that didn't require much of his attention. He was one of the senior judges after all and had attended these seminars countless times. He barely registered Jasmine's presence when she walked into the room, standing tall at the front as one of the main speakers. The moment her gaze met his, however, he froze for just an instant. She was dressed in a crisp professional suit, radiating authority and confidence and energy that immediately commanded the room. It didn't take long for him to realize who she was, and when his eyes widened slightly, Jasmine met his gaze, her face unreadable. The seminar began, and Harding sat back in his chair, ready to tune out the familiar talks about fairness, ethics, and unconscious bias. He had heard it all before, but as Jasmine began to speak, he found himself paying attention. Her voice was calm but firm, and the words she spoke carried weight that echoed in the back of his mind. She spoke about the impact of unconscious bias in the courtroom, how it could manifest in the way a judge interacted with defendants, especially those from marginalized communities. She detailed how the justice system often treated people as stereotypes, not individuals, and how those biases could shape the way cases were ruled. Harding shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He couldn't help but wonder if this was meant to be some sort of indirect criticism of him. Then Jasmine turned the conversation to the very topic he had been trying to avoid, her own case, the fine he had handed down in his croon. She didn't name him directly, but she described a real-world example of how bias could manifest in seemingly small everyday decisions. Harding's heart skipped a beat, his mind raced as he connected the dots. This was about him, wasn't it? He felt a wave of shame wash over him, his body stiffening as his own actions were scrutinized without his knowledge. The room felt suddenly hot, the air heavy with the weight of his guilt, but Jasmine, unfazed, continued her lecture, focusing on how every decision in the courtroom had consequences beyond the legalities, how the human element was always at play. She spoke with such conviction, and Harding could feel her words cutting through the walls he had built around himself. It was clear that this wasn't just a seminar to her, it was a personal mission. Harding sat there speechless, wondering how long she had known and whether she would confront him directly. As the session concluded, Jasmine caught his eye once more, a flicker of recognition passing between them. She said nothing, but Harding knew that she was fully aware of what had transpired in his courtroom, and in that moment he realized that he couldn't run from this, not anymore. The confrontation he had been dreading was inevitable, and he had no choice but to face it. The seminar ended, but Judge Harding sat frozen in his chair. The final words of Jasmine's Speech still ringing in his ears, the room had emptied, but he remained staring at the empty space where she had stood just moments before. His mind raced a blurter of confusion, guilt and shame, the realization that Jasmine had been speaking directly to him, that her case had been the one she described, not at him. He had been blind, thoughtless, and worse, unfair. He had dismissed her without a second thought, without considering who she was or why she was there. He had done what he had always done, treating defendants as faceless cases no different from one another, but now the weight of that judgment was crushing him. Thomas Harding was a man who prided himself on his objectivity. He believed that a judge's role was to remain impartial, to follow the law with unwavering clarity, but now, as he sat in the echoing silence of the conference room, he was forced to confront something he had long ignored: his own biases. In all his years on the bench, he had never once questioned how his own assumptions colored his decisions. He had never considered that he might be part of the problem, perpetuating the very injustices he swore to uphold. But Jasmine had forced him to see it: her calm, unwavering presence in the courtroom, her quiet dignity in the face of his cold judgment. It had all been too easy for him to overlook. She had been a challenge to his preconceptions, and he had failed her. Harding's chest tightened. He thought back to the day of her trial, how he had been dismissive, how he had barely listened to her defense. He had seen a black woman in front of him and immediately made assumptions about her worth, about her intelligence, about her role in society. He had judged her based on the color of her skin, on a surface-level assessment, without taking the time to understand the whole picture. He had thought her case insignificant, her explanation unworthy of his attention, and in doing so he had denied her the very justice he was meant to deliver. He rubbed his hand over his face, trying to push away the gnawing feeling that had taken root inside him. His pride, his ego, wanted to deny it, to dismiss it as another routine error, but deep down he knew better. This was no simple mistake. This was a failure of character, a failure to see the humanity and those who stood before him. And the worst part, he had done it without even realizing it, without seeing the damage he was causing. In later that night, Harding couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the moment when Jasmine had looked him directly in the eyes during the seminar, when he had realized she knew exactly who he was. The shame that had washed over him then still lingered. He had spent his life in the courtroom, but now it felt as if he had never truly understood what it meant to be a judge. A judge was not just someone who followed the law. A judge was someone who had to recognize the humanity in every person who came before them, someone who had to understand that justice was not just about facts and statutes, but about empathy, fairness, and compassion. His thoughts drifted to his colleagues, to the other judges he worked with, who often shared his dismissive attitude toward cases they deemed small or trivial. He had fallen into that same trap. He had let his frustrations and exhaustion cloud his judgment, and in doing so he had become part of a system that perpetuated harm rather than justice. He knew that something had to change, but what could he do? How could he make amends for the damage he had done, not just to Jasmine but to everyone who had come before him in the courtroom? And worse, what if this was only the tip of the iceberg? What if his biases had influenced other rulings, other lives? He couldn't undo the past, but he could try to be better. He had to. The next morning, Harding called his assistant and scheduled a meeting with Jasmine. He knew he had to face her, to apologize. It was the least he could do, but he also hoped it would be the first step toward redemption. The meeting was scheduled for the next day, and Judge Harding spent the hours leading up to it in a state of unease. His hands fidgeted on the desk as he scanned through case files that required his attention, but none of it seemed to stick. His thoughts kept drifting back to Jasmine, to the moment of realization in the seminar when he saw the depth of his mistake. He had spent his entire career priding himself on being fair, objective, and above bias, but now he couldn't escape the nagging suspicion that he had failed in the most basic way. When the time for the meeting finally came, he stood up, smoothed his suit, and took a deep breath before walking down the hall toward her office. He had never felt more nervous in his life. Jasmine Reed had held his future in her hand ever since the moment she stepped into that courtroom, and now he was about to confront her. He wasn't sure if she would even agree to hear him out. After all, how could he justify the way he had treated her? When he arrived at her office, he knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. Jasmine was sitting behind her desk flipping through some documents. She didn't look up immediately, and for a moment Harding felt like he was standing before a judge rather than the other way around. His nerves settled slightly as he spoke. "M. Reed, thank you for meeting with me," he began, his voice steady but with an undertone of hesitation. "I know I owe you an apology, and I don't want to waste your time." Jasmine put down her papers and looked up at him, her expression neutral but sharp. "I'm listening, Judge Harding," she said, her voice calm yet firm, as if she had expected this moment. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking about our encounter in the courtroom and the seminar, and I realize how wrong I was. I didn't listen to you, I dismissed you, I didn't take your case seriously, and I didn't consider your humanity. I failed You as a judge, and more than that, I failed in my duty to serve justice. You didn't deserve that." Jasmine's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply nodded, her silence making him feel the weight of his words. She could feel the sincerity in his apology, but it was more than just an apology that was needed. She had witnessed firsthand how systemic biases ran deep, even in people who thought they were beyond them. Harding continued, "I spent my career focused on the law, on the facts, but I didn't see you, Jasmine. I didn't see the person standing in front of me, the struggles you might have faced, the strength you carry. I can't undo what I've done, but I want to learn. I want to do better, both as a judge and as a person. Please, I need your help." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of the desk. She had heard similar apologies before, empty promises made by others who had been caught in their ignorance, but there was something in his words, something in the way he admitted his mistakes, that made her pause. This wasn't a man trying to save face, this was a man trying to do better. She studied him for a long moment before responding, "Judge Harding, it's not enough just to apologize. You can't just wake up one day and decide to be different. You have to confront your biases and understand where they come from. You have to do the work, and more importantly, you have to acknowledge the power you hold in the courtroom. Your decisions don't just affect cases, they affect lives, and I want you to understand that." Harding nodded, his throat tightening as the gravity of her words sank in. He wasn't ready for an easy fix, but he was ready to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. "Tell me what I need to do," he said, his voice earnest. Jadson stood up from her desk and walked to the whiteboard where she had been outlining the next session for the judiciary's mandatory implicit bias training. She turned to him and said, "I'm leading a training for judges on bias, fairness, and the intersectionality of race and law. In a few days you're going to attend, and you're going to engage. This isn't just about learning the right words, it's about changing the way you think and act. It's about confronting your own blind spots, even when it's uncomfortable." Harding was taken aback. This wasn't going to be a quick fix or a simple gesture of goodwill. He would have to work to learn, and most importantly, to be vulnerable in ways that he had never been before. "I'm ready," he said with a sense of determination that had been lacking before. Jasmine looked at him, searching his face for any signs of insincerity. When she found none, she gave a slight nod. "Then we start there." The next steps were unclear, but Harding knew one thing for sure: he couldn't undo the past, but he had the power to change the future, and with Jasmine's help he would find his way. The day of the training arrived, and Judge Harding walked into the seminar room with a sense of both apprehension and determination. He had spent the previous week reflecting on his actions, reading about bias in the courtroom, and understanding the broader implications of systemic injustice, but he knew this would be different. This was not just about theory, this was about confronting his own blind spots, acknowledging the mistakes he had made, and most importantly, learning how to do better. The room was filled with judges from various courts across the city, all sitting at long polished tables. Jasmine was at the front, standing with a calm yet commanding presence, ready to begin. Harding found his seat in the middle of the room, trying not to draw attention to himself. He was among his peers, but this felt different. He was no longer the confident, unchallenged judge. Today he was a student novice, and the weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Jasmine began the session by addressing the group, her voice steady and authoritative. "Thank you all for being here today. We're going to have an honest conversation about bias in the courtroom. This is not a lecture on theory, this is a discussion about real actionable change." Harding couldn't help but notice how her words immediately commanded the room's attention. She had a way of speaking that cut through the noise, drawing people in without force. Her calmness was disarming, and yet there was a firmness in her tone that conveyed the seriousness of the subject matter. "Bias doesn't just come from overt racism or sexism," Jasmine continued, pacing slowly in front of the group. "It comes from our lived experiences, from what we've been taught, and from the assumptions we make, often without realizing it. It's in the small things, the way we look at a defendant, the way we read a case, the way we apply the law. It's not just about being fair, it's about recognizing how our biases shape the decisions we make." Harding shifted in his seat, uncomfortable but paying attention. He could feel the eyes of his fellow judges subtly drifting toward him. They all knew about the incident with Jasmine. They had discussed it among themselves in hushed whispers. Harding had a reputation as a non-nonsense by-the-book judge, but now there was a growing realization among them that perhaps he wasn't as perfect as he had once seemed. Jasmine turned her focus to the next part of the training, a series of case studies designed to test the judge's decision-making processes. The cases were real-world examples where bias, whether racial, gendered, or socioeconomic, had played a role in the judicial outcome. She distributed handouts detailing the cases, and the judges were asked to examine them, discuss their rulings, and reflect on their personal biases. Harding picked up the first case file and began reading. The case described a young black woman who had been arrested for a minor offense but was sentenced to an unusually harsh penalty. As he read the details, Harding's heart sank. The woman's background, the context of her arrest, and the fact that she had no prior criminal record should have been taken into account, but it was clear that the judge had opposed the harsh sentence based on assumptions about her race and socioeconomic status. Harding felt a jolt of recognition. This was exactly what he had done in his own courtroom with Jasmine. He had seen her as just another defendant, a faceless person to be processed without considering the full context of her life, the nuances that might have influenced her actions. It was easy to make assumptions about people based on stereotypes, but now Harding saw how dangerous that mindset was. As the judges broke into small groups to discuss the cases, Harding found himself paired with Jasmine. She watched him closely, as though expecting him to grapple with the discomfort of the exercise. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unsure of where to start. The words he had spoken to her earlier felt inadequate now. Apologizing once had not been enough. He needed to show her and himself that he was truly committed to change. After a long pause, Harding finally spoke, his voice more tentative than usual. I see now how easy it is to miss the bigger picture, to look at someone and make assumptions based on a few details without considering the full story. He looked directly at Jasmine, his gaze steady. I did that to you, and it wasn't right. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. Instead, she nodded, her expression unreadable. It was clear that she was waiting for more, waiting for him to dig deeper, to acknowledge that it wasn't just about the fine he had imposed on her, but about his role in a system that often overlooked people like her, people who had been judged before they even stepped foot in the courtroom. I think I've been blind, Harding continued, his voice gaining confidence. I've been so focused on the law that I forgot the human element, the real stories behind each case. I've never stopped to consider how my decisions affect the lives of people who come before me, and that's something I need to change. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving his. For the first time since their encounter in the courtroom, Harding felt a flicker of hope that perhaps he could make a difference, not just in his own life but in the way he interacted with everyone who came before him. The training continued, but Harding's mind was elsewhere, reflecting on the weight of the responsibility he carried. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while he felt like he was finally on the path to becoming the judge he had always aspired to be, a judge who saw people, not cases. Weeks passed since the training, and though Judge Harding continued to go through the motions of his work, something inside him had shifted. Every case, every defendant, every ruling he made felt different now. He couldn't look at anyone in the courtroom the same way. Jasmine's words echoed in his mind constantly. It's not just about being fair, it's about recognizing how our biases shape the decisions we make. At first, Harding's efforts felt awkward and forced. He found himself constantly second-guessing his decisions, wondering if he was overcompensating in his attempt to be more mindful. He questioned whether he was truly changing or simply putting on a facade. Her journey was slow, filled with moments of frustration and doubt, but he pressed on. One morning, a case came across his desk that would test him in ways he hadn't anticipated. A young man, James Turner, stood accused of shoplifting. On the surface, it seemed like a simple case, another petty theft to be processed. Harding read through the file. A picture of the defendant began to emerge. James was a 19-year-old from a low-income neighborhood struggling to find work after his father had passed away. He had a prior arrest for a minor drug-related offense, but there was no sign of violent behavior, no indication that he was a habitual offender. It seemed like a mistake, a young man trying to survive in a system that offered him few opportunities. Harding's initial impulse was to treat it like any other shoplifting case. It was straightforward, but then as he sat there he remembered what he had learned in the training. He thought about James's background, about the challenges he had faced, about the way society had already written him off. Would he have treated this case the same way before? The answer was clear. He would have handed down the usual fine with no consideration for the circumstances that had led James to this point. He would have viewed him through the lens of his previous biases, just another type of defendant. Instead, Harding decided to do something different. He scheduled a meeting with James before the hearing. The young man looked nervous when he entered the judge's chambers, hands fidgeting as he sat across from Harding. The tension in the room was palpable, but Harding made a conscious effort to put him at ease. James, he began, his voice softer than usual, I've looked over your case and I'd like to understand more about what led you to this situation. Shoplifting isn't something that happens in a vacuum. I'm interested in hearing your story. The young man seemed taken aback, but he quickly relaxed, sensing that this was not going to be the typical courtroom exchange. James spoke about his struggles to find stable work, the mounting pressure to support his mother and younger siblings, and the loneliness that had settled in since his father's death. Harding listened intently, nodding occasionally as he realized how much he had overlooked in his previous judgments. By the end of the conversation, Harding knew that this was a turning point, not Just for James but for himself, he decided to offer James a diversion program where he would undergo counseling and community service rather than simply imposing a fine or jail time. He explained his decision to James in the courtroom, stressing the importance of addressing the root causes of criminal behavior rather than just punishing the outcome. As the hearing concluded, Harding saw something he had never expected: gratitude in James's eyes. The young man had entered the courtroom expecting the usual punishment, but instead, he was being given a chance to redeem himself, and it wasn't just a chance for James, it was a chance for Harding to prove to himself that he could be the kind of judge he had always aspired to be, the kind of judge who saw more than just the surface. Later that day, Harding was in his office when Jasmine called. It was rare for her to reach out personally, but he had learned to expect that her guidance didn't come with a schedule. She got straight to the point. "I heard about the Turner case," she said. "You handled it well." Harding felt a weight lift off his chest. "It wasn't easy, but I felt like it was the right thing to do." "I agree," Jasmine said, her tone warm but serious. "It's small steps, but they add up. Keep challenging yourself, Harding. Don't let the discomfort of change stop you from pushing forward. The people you serve will thank you for it, even if they don't always say it out loud." He smiled slightly. "I'm starting to believe that." Jasmine's voice softened. "It's not about being perfect, it's about being better than you were yesterday, and today you were better." As he hung up the phone, Harding leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the conversation. This wasn't the end of his journey, he had no illusions about that, but it was a step forward, and for the first time in a long time he was proud of the work he was doing. The changes were subtle, imperceptible to most, but for Harding they felt monumental, and as long as he kept moving forward, he knew that the change could stick. The next day, another case arrived on his docket, and as he read through the file, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. There was still work to be done, but for the first time he felt like he was on the right path. Months had passed since Judge Harding had taken the first steps toward change, and though his transformation hadn't been instant, the shift was unmistakable. The weight of his old biases, once so ingrained in his judicial decisions, had loosened piece by piece. He no longer viewed the people who stood before him as cases to be processed, but as individuals with stories, struggles, and lives shaped by circumstances far beyond the courtroom's walls. The ripple effects of his newfound approach weren't just confined to his own courtroom. His colleagues, who had once admired him for his unflinching adherence to the law, began to notice a subtle change in the way he interacted with defendants. There was more empathy in his demeanor, more patience in his questioning, and a greater willingness to explore the complexities of each case. Though some were skeptical, others were intrigued. They saw a man who was willing to confront his flaws, to grow, and perhaps most importantly, to embrace a new vision of justice, one that didn't just apply the law but also acknowledged the humanity behind every case. Judge Harding's relationship with Jasmine had also deepened. They met regularly, discussing the cases he was struggling with, the moments of doubt he still experienced. Jasmine had become not just a colleague but a mentor, someone who had helped him open his eyes to a reality he had long ignored. Their conversations were candid and often uncomfortable, but they had forged a mutual respect and understanding that transcended their initial encounter. One day, Harding found himself presiding over a particularly difficult case. A young woman, Maria Lopez, had been arrested for theft. At first glance, it seemed like another simple case of shoplifting, but as he read through her background, Harding saw that Maria's situation was far more complex. She had been living in an abusive relationship, struggling to keep her children fed and housed, and had resorted to theft out of desperation. Her criminal record was minimal, and the circumstances surrounding the crime spoke more to survival than to criminal intent. Maria sat in the courtroom, her face a mask of fear and shame. She had been labeled a criminal, but Harding saw something different in her eyes, a woman who had been broken by a system that had failed her at every turn. He paused for a moment, considering his options. He could easily have imposed a standard sentence, but he knew that wouldn't solve the underlying issue. He could see, as he had with James Turner, that the law wasn't the only factor to consider. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about understanding and offering second chances. Turning to Maria, he asked her to speak. The room fell silent as she hesitantly began to explain her situation. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, Harding could see her gaining confidence. She spoke of her children, of her attempts to escape her abusive partner, and of the shame she carried every day. It was a story he had heard many times before in various forms, but this time it felt different. This time it felt personal. After she finished, Harding looked at her with empathy, his voice steady but kind. "Maria, your actions were wrong, but I understand why you acted as you did. Your circumstances don't excuse what happened, but they do explain it. I'm going to offer you a program for counseling and support as well as community service. You will be given a chance to prove that you can turn things around, but it's up to you to take that chance." Maria's eyes widened, and for the first time in the proceedings, a small but genuine smile tugged at her lips. She had expected jail time, maybe a fine, but instead she was being given the opportunity to rebuild her life, to break free from the cycle of poverty and abuse that had defined her existence. As the gavel came down, Harding felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was the kind of justice he had always wanted to deliver, justice that acknowledged the person, not just the crime. As Maria was escorted out of the courtroom, Harding found himself looking around at the other faces in the room. His peers, the attorneys, and even the officers present were witnessing a shift, a subtle yet undeniable change in how justice was being served. That evening, Harding received a call from Jasmine. Her voice was warm but laced with pride. "I heard about the Lopez case. You handled it well, Harding. You're getting it." He smiled. "I think I am." Jasmine's words echoed in his mind. "It's not about being perfect, it's about being better than you were yesterday." And for the first time, Harding believed it. He had come a long way from the judge who had blindly imposed a fine on Jasmine Reed, not seeing her as a person but as just another case. Now he was a man who sought to understand, to listen, and to act with compassion. The transformation had not been easy, and there would be setbacks along the way, but Harding knew that he was on a path of growth, a path where his decisions reflected not only the law but also the humanity that should always have been a part of it. As the months wore on, more and more cases came through his courtroom, each one challenging him in new ways, but each time Harding felt more confident in his ability to balance the law with the compassion that justice demanded. And in the quiet moments when he found himself reflecting on the road he had traveled, he knew that the work he was doing would leave behind a legacy, one of understanding, empathy, and a belief that true justice didn't just come from following the rules but from seeing people for who they truly were.